There's three things that are useful in terms of being able to make sense of the Chinese state apparatus. And the first thing has to do with rank, the rank of various bureaucracies, the ranks of various administrative units, be they provinces, municipalities, counties, what have you. The second dimension is the degree to which a particular institution is centralized or decentralized. I'm going to talk about what decentralization and centralization mean, and then I'm going to also show you why that matters. And then the third dimension is one that I borrow from the movie All the President's Men, and that's this notion of following the money. Because very often people are not sure what to make of authority relations in China, kind of where they begin, where they end, who's the person that really calls the shots in this particular instance or in that particular instance. And a really, really useful shorthand to that is following the money. And when I mean following the money, I don't mean things like bribes and corruption and side payments and extra budgetary revenues, although those all play a role. But rather, I'm talking about something far more mundane and prosaic, and that is this notion of the politics of budgets. And so these are all kind of the three key legs on which the Chinese institutional tripod stand. So China has three gargantuan bureaucracies: the government, the party, and the military. And I'm going to speak mostly about the government today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the party. And I'm really not going to say much about the military, apart from what I'm just going to say here at the opening. So the Chinese government apparatus essentially does what any government apparatus does. Not to belittle it or trivialize it, but governments ensure that the trains run on time, that the garbage is collected, that essentially the rhythms of life are maintained. And that policy is developed and maintained and managed, and essentially to provide the types of services that states generally provide for their citizens. And in this sense, that China is not terribly different from any other state, regardless necessarily of regime type. The government also helps implement the decisions not only of the government, but of the party apparatus. And that leads me to the second large institution, that is the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, really, it makes the large kind of normative policy decisions, kind of the line, if you will, the general kind of mood of the state. And in addition to that, it also supervises the government implementation of government policy and of party policy. And ultimately, one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today is the degree to which the state, the government of the Chinese state, the government part of the Chinese state, remains quite decentralized. And in that sense, the party provides one of the key centralizing mechanisms to ensure that the government apparatus conforms to the goals and the wants of the party. The third bureaucracy, the one that I'm not really going to be talking about much today, is the People's Liberation Army. I just want to kind of note two things. The People's Liberation Army has two roles. The first is to protect the country from foreign invasion. The second one, and this is key, it's to protect the Chinese Communist Party from insurrection. It's not to protect the state or the government from insurrection. It's to protect the Chinese Communist Party from insurrection. So think about it. You have the military reporting not to the government at its highest level, but to the party. And that's something that it's really important for people to keep in mind. Starting with kind of the most kind of simple kind of layout of the Chinese government bureaucracy, I'm going to start at the level of the national government. The person who is in charge of the government apparatus, the highest ranking government official, is the premier. The premier sits atop of an executive body called the State Council. And the State Council is made up of several vice premiers and state councilors. As you go from premier to vice premier to state councilor, the portfolios become less and less generalized and more specific, although even at the state councilor level, each individual state councilor has a number of multiple portfolios. One of the organs that reports to the State Council is the National People's Congress, which I'm not going to talk about much today, but the National People's Congress is the legislative body of the People's Republic of China. And although in the past it has been little more than a rubber stamp, I think today it's safe to call it something a bit more than a rubber stamp, which is to say, even though it doesn't have the type of autonomous power that one would kind of accord a legislative body, the National People's Congress is the place where a lot of the policymaking, the discussions for policymaking between officials, whether they're government or party officials, experts, both Chinese and foreign, take place. And it's a place that's very, very rich in terms of ideas and solutions from a purely policy standpoint. In terms of the kind of executive administration of the government, you've got commissions, ministries, bureaus, and offices. And each of these largely are akin to departments in the United States, for example. The thing that separates them largely is this notion of rank. So commissions are a half step above a ministry outranks a bureau, and a bureau outranks an office. So one question that people might have is, what are the ministries in China? And these ministries change over time. Currently they look like this. And Chinese ministries essentially, like ministries in any country, will give you a good idea, a snapshot of what the priorities of the state are at any given time. And so this is not, this list here is not a secret. It's something that you can pretty much get off of Google. But it gives you an idea of kind of what are the priorities of the Chinese state and how these priorities are organized into policy. In addition to ministries, you have other state council offices. These are offices that are directly managed by the state council. So even though they are of a kind of a lower rank officially than ministries, the fact that they have a direct line to the state council, which outranks all ministries and commissions and other bureaucracies at the national level, this gives them some sort of, I wouldn't call it informal power, but it's kind of power that is less overt, but nonetheless quite real. One of the things that is important to realize about the Chinese bureaucracy is that the government apparatus was really constructed in the 1950s, in the mid-1950s. This was a time of kind of high Stalinist economic development, and this was the time in Chinese political history when China was really the most centralized it's ever been, at least as far as the government is concerned. And what's really important to remember is that institutions, whether in China or anywhere else, institutions tend to change much slower than reality outside of these institutions do. Life changes quickly, institutions much slower. As a result, if you think about that, if you do the math, these bureaucracies were built in the mid-1950s. We are 60 years out from there, and very often you've got situations, you've got problems and challenges facing these bureaucracies that the bureaucracies themselves were not built to be able to handle. And so one of the things that the Chinese government does is that when there's a complex problem, and nowadays that really becomes a redundant term, because problems have become increasingly complex in Chinese, in terms of the Chinese policymaking world. What you have is you have several of these bureaucracies essentially being brought together and tied together essentially like a cord of wood bureaucracies that are involved in some aspect of dealing with this policy. No single bureaucracy is able to handle the policy itself, and as a result, you get a number of bureaucracies that are brought in together. And these are referred to in the Chinese bureaucratic term, 系统. Getting back to the three things that we should all kind of take into account when we think about how the Chinese state operates. The first has to do with bureaucratic rank. This is, for many people, have the assumption that in China, things are not what they seem. I remember before I first went to China, I had somebody who pretty much screwed up my first year in China by giving me this advice, which was, people never say what they mean. Nothing is what it seems. Everything is the opposite of. So as a result, I didn't know what I was doing in China. And in fact, some of this kind of spills over into this idea that, well, people have their formal ranks, but then they have all this informal stuff going on. That's true up to a point, but really one's official bureaucratic rank is something that provides a tremendous amount of information, and it is something that is taken quite seriously, and it's a standard that allows kind of interaction within the policymaking universe, and it really provides the various actors within it the type of information they need in terms of who to listen to, who not to listen to, who to consult with, and who to pretty much ignore, as well as who to fear. So not only does administrative rank refer to various functional bureaucracies like ministries, commissions, and the like, but they also refer to administrative divisions kind of geographically within China. So, for example, a ministry is the same, so a ministry in Beijing is the same bureaucratic rank as a province. So you have a provincial governor working together with a minister in Beijing. The two of them essentially either have to agree on something or some sort of compromise. One cannot order the other one to do something that the other one does not want to do. So, for example, when you've got kind of large projects that involve two or more ministries, as well as involving two or more administrative levels in China, that really becomes kind of a natural experiment for how politics unfold in China. So kind of the paradigm case of this would be the Three Gorges Dam, where not only do you have several different ministries and commissions involved at the national level, but you also have several provincial governments as well as municipalities that were involved and had different types of stakes in the system. So, for example, the provinces that were downstream of the Three Gorges Dam didn't want the dam height to be very high because they were afraid that that would negatively affect irrigation and flood control kind of below the dam. Whereas the upstream provinces, particularly the municipality of Chongqing, really wanted the dam height to be as high as possible. Why? Because this would allow 10,000-ton steamers into the port of Chongqing and would really make Chongqing kind of a deep water port in the middle of China. And that was something that the Chongqing government was pushing very, very strongly for. Eventually, they had to compromise. But that gives you an idea of the types of bureaucratic bargaining that is endemic throughout the Chinese system, and the things that the rules of the game have a lot to do with the ranks of the individual units that are involved, be they provinces, be they ministries, be they units even below those. The second part of understanding the importance of authority relations within the Chinese bureaucracy, if the first one has to do with rank, the second one has to do with the degree of centralization or decentralization of a particular unit within that system. And let me talk a little bit about what I mean about centralization and decentralization. So for many of us, we think of China, particularly people who are not who are casual observers of China, they tend to throw words around like totalitarian, words like, or they think of China as a place that's where leaders in Beijing pretty much tell, they make their goals, their wants, their desires known, and then the rest of the country kind of jumps and shakes in their boots. In fact, that's not the way in which things work at all. In fact, quite the opposite. One of the things that I will argue in this section of the module is that China is an extraordinarily decentralized country when it comes to at least the government apparatus, and that in fact it has become increasingly decentralized over time. So China, when in its first decade, so really from starting around 1953, 1954, began to implement the first 5-year plan of economic development, which was borrowed kind of lock, stock, and barrel from the Soviet Union, along with thousands of Soviet advisors that helped implement this plan. This was when, as I mentioned, the ministries and other kind of national level bureaucracies were developed. And really it was at this time where the government of China was at its most centralized. Really from that point, so the first 5-year plan finished in 1957, from that point on, China was basically an exercise in different types of experiments with decentralization. So, for example, the Great Leap Forward, which went from 1958 to 1961, was in many senses a way of the party to take over some of the economic decision-making powers from the government and essentially attempt to develop China both in the urban areas and in the countryside through mass organization and through things like backyard steel furnaces, mass campaigns one after the other, and it resulted in a famine in 1960, 1961, which killed upwards of 30 million people. So this was something that was halted and not repeated. The Cultural Revolution, which went from 1966 till 1977, was also arguably an exercise in decentralization, whereby Mao Zedong sought to destroy the actual party apparatus that he had built up himself, because he felt that it was moving away from the socialist road that he felt that China needed to follow, and as a result, Mao kind of had to use a form of guerrilla warfare against these institutions and decentralized power not only to kind of lower level institutions but to people unbound by institutions, that is the Chinese youth in the form of Red Guards, particularly from 1966 to 1969, where the Red Guards surrounded and destroyed many of these institutions. That too was an exercise in decentralization, but also one that China has sought not to repeat, and for good reasons. The type of decentralized milieu that we find ourselves in China today has to do with one of the kind of key dynamics is in 1978, the Reform Coalition of Deng Xiaoping, Chen Yun, and others decided that for China to develop economically, a lot of the decision-making had to be downshifted to the local levels, which is to say that this type of economic decision-making that was going on in Beijing through various bureaucracies that were managing the planned economy, that really these were not going to help China kind of develop economically into a world where it would compete with the other East Asian tigers and advanced industrial democracies. And so a lot of the economic decision-making, and with it, some of the political decision-making power was downshifted to the provinces. And this also led to kind of a rebirth, if you will, of one of the kind of traditional dynamics between the center and the local in China. There's a Chinese saying that 上有政治,下有对策, which basically translates to those at the top have their policies, those of us down here at the bottom, we have our countermeasures. And so one of the key dynamics of Chinese governance today, as well as in the past, has been this tug of war between kind of national preferences and those of the localities. Which brings me to the primary mechanism of understanding centralization and decentralization. This gets technical, but it's really, really important. If you understand this, you understand maybe 2/3 of how things work in China, at least as far as authority relations in the government bureaucracies. So there are essentially, and I'm simplifying greatly here, but there are essentially two types of relationships between any two units within China. The first is kind of a professional, kind of non-binding relationship, which is referred to as 业务关系 or professional relations. There is another type of relationship, which is binding. And this is where a superior unit issues orders to a subordinate unit, and a subordinate unit has to listen. And these are referred to as leadership relations, or 领导关系. And so the key logic here unfolds in 2 steps. So the first step is to understand that every unit in China has all sorts of relationships with all sorts of other units. And I'm going to illustrate this graphically in just a moment. But one unit in China will have relations with any number of other units in China. It will have non-binding professional relations with just about all of them, but it will only have binding leadership relations with one other unit. That's the key thing to remember. It will only have binding leadership relations with one other unit. So the key then becomes figuring out which is that other unit. And this leads me to the second part of this logic, and that is these leadership relations can be centralized leadership relations, which is to say they can move vertically up the administrative hierarchy, or they can be decentralized. These leadership relations can be decentralized and work along a horizontal administrative axis. And I'm going to illustrate each of these in just a moment. But if you understand this, you understand a huge part of the ways in which authority relations work in China. So, let me give you an illustration of what I just said, but graphically. In China, you have, let's say you've got a provincial bureau of X. So this would be a provincial level ministry unit. So it's a functional unit that is the provincial counterpart of a ministry in Beijing. Now, it would have all sorts of relations with any number of other units, including the provincial government, including the ministry that is the counterpart of that bureau at the national level, as well as any number of other units. In the case of centralized leadership relations, it will have professional or non-binding relations with any number of these other units, but as with any other unit, it will only have leadership relations with one other unit. If these leadership relations are centralized, they will be with the same functional unit at the next administrative level up. So in the case of the General Administration of Customs, it has leadership relations over its counterparts all over the country. And if the local level of customs, in this case I have a kind of a generic local customs unit called Guangdong Customs. if they get all sorts of instructions and information and orders and requests from any number of other units, they know that the only people they really have to pay attention to when push comes to shove is the General Administration of Customs in Beijing. That is centralized leadership relations. Now, a lot of people conflate this idea with leadership relations with centralized leadership relations. And it's important that you don't do that. And I'm going to illustrate what decentralized leadership relations look like. So let's say in this case you've got the Bureau of Agriculture in Sichuan province. Again, it gets all sorts of information from any number of other units in China. Who does it listen to? In this case, its leadership relations are decentralized. So if it were centralized, it would, like the General Administration of Customs, take its marching orders from the Ministry of Agriculture in Beijing. But because the leadership relations are decentralized in this case, the Sichuan Bureau of Agriculture takes its marching orders not from the Ministry of Agriculture in Beijing, but from the Sichuan provincial government. This is very, very important to understand because, and this is something that is quite counterintuitive, the vast majority, 90% of all government units in China have decentralized leadership relations, which, when you understand that, explains some of the sluggishness and the drag in the system that keeps Beijing bureaucrats awake at night and frustrated during the day. The third part of understanding Chinese institutions has to do with following the money. And this is actually something that is tied to the previous discussion on centralization and decentralization, this idea of following the money. In China, the way in which budgets are allocated, and again, I'm simplifying here, but it's also somewhat counterintuitive. It's the opposite by which we understand how budgets are allocated, say, in the United States. So in the United States, for example, you would be allocated a budget of this much, and given the allocation that you have, then you can decide that you can hire this many people based on the budgetary allocation that you have. In China, this is the opposite in the way in which it's done, which is to say you are allocated a number of personnel. Each person brings a certain amount of budget with that person, and this budget essentially covers personnel, so the personnel wages, stipend, what have you, but it also includes money set aside for budgetary operations as well as things like computers, vehicles, and other things necessary for the functioning of the office. The Chinese shorthand for this is 人才务. The idea of this budgetary allocation in which personnel, budget, and these property rights are combined is a Chinese term called 编制. 编制, unfortunately, has no direct translation into English. I think probably the best thing to, the best way to translate it is to look at it, or to call it a budgetary allocation. The way in which 编制 is allocated is quite important. There is usually at the national level, you've got both government and party bureaucracies that send their leaders into consultation with one another, including the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Personnel, you've got a representative of the State Council, and you've got the Chinese Communist Party Organization Department. They work together to decide the number of budgetary allocations for the entire country. These are then distributed among the various units within China. If you've got a centralized leadership relations based bureaucracy, as in customs, the personnel allocations for the entire customs bureaucracy is given to the Customs General Administration of Customs in Beijing, and they then allocate to each of their offices all over China. But remember, I mentioned that somewhere around 90% of leadership relations in China are decentralized. So very often what you have is a situation where each province gets a personnel allocation for all of the units at the provincial level and below. And it then decides, it has another committee, just like the one that I just mentioned, with including people from the Bureau of Personnel, the Bureau of Finance, representatives of the provincial government and the provincial organization department. And they sit around and they decide which provincial level bureau gets how many people. And this becomes a very, very kind of contested part of kind of budgetary politics in China. I remember I visited a provincial level Bianzhi allocating organization. It's actually called the Bianzhi Committee, or the Bianwei. And I remember kind of walking in there, and this is about 10 years or so ago, when you could still smoke in your offices. And I remember not being able to see on the other side of the room because the air was so thick with smoke. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was that the types of cigarettes that they were smoking were Chonghua cigarettes, which are very kind of high-end cigarettes. They cost about $10 a pack. And the rate at which these bureaucrats were smoking, pretty much they smoked their entire monthly salary during the course of our meeting. And it became, fairly clear to us that they weren't paying for these cigarettes, but rather what happened was you would have any number of agencies, kind of provincial level bureaus, sending the representatives to the Bianwei, asking them if they would consider maybe upping their budgetary allocation by 1 or 2 people. And, oh, by the way, we have these 5 cartons of cigarettes. We don't know what to do with them. Can we just leave them here? So this becomes a key node of understanding kind of how, not only how budgets are allocated, but also how authority relations are, the shape that they take within the Chinese bureaucracy. Why? Because essentially the allocation of Bianzhi follows precisely this idea of centralized and decentralized leadership relations. It is the currency, if you will, by which those authority relations make themselves known. And this is something that's very, very important to understand and see how it fits together. So far I've been talking about China's government apparatus. I haven't really mentioned the party at all. And what I want to do now is kind of give a brief sketch about kind of the role of the party, both in terms of what the party does, but also vis-a-vis the government apparatus itself. One of the things that people think about when they think about the Chinese Communist Party in China is they think of party members as kind of the sinister keepers of the ideological flame, when in fact, life of a party member in China is far more mundane and prosaic than such an idea might lead one to believe. It is also a responsibility, a function that is not solely focused on kind of ideological indoctrination and the molding of the citizenry, but is very much in the service of good governance and kind of the management of both party members and government bureaucrats. Let me give you an example. I have a friend who was rising through the party ranks, and we were originally supposed to, her family and me were supposed to go out for lunch, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've got an all-day meeting, an all-day party meeting. I cannot go with you, but go with my family and I'll join you for dinner." Fine. And then she asked me, "So would you be interested in seeing what the agenda is, for the meeting?" And I said, "I'd love to." So she showed it to me. So essentially you have kind of the entire party apparatus for a provincial level bureaucracy spending a whole day in a retreat to discuss a book that was put out by the Gallup organization called First Break Every Rule. Essentially what the party was focusing on was on management techniques that had been developed in the United States, something that was very, very different from spending the day talking about Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. So the party very much is kind of involved in essentially not only trying to kind of maintain the normative orientation of the country, and not only involved in trying to supervise the party and the government, but also in terms of, in some cases, trying to fix some of the problems inherent in governance vis-a-vis the government apparatus, but also, unfortunately, in reality, also tends to really complicate things within the government and within the party. So this is an organizational chart of the party, very much simplified. The key bureaucracies for the party have to do with propaganda and organization. The organization department is akin to a ministry, but within the party apparatus. The organization department is very, very important because this is the way in which the party is ultimately able to control the government apparatus. And I'm going to break this down into a number of different dimensions. But the key thing here is that the top one or two positions in any government bureaucracy or any government office in China, and this includes schools, hospitals, banks, what have you, they have to not only be given to a party member, but the party member has to be chosen by the party. And so by this simple mandate, the party is able to essentially make sure that they have their man or woman in a position of power at every stage of the governance structure. I'll come back to that in just a moment. The highest level of the party, the highest office is the Politburo Standing Committee, which includes top government officials, so the premier as well as the chairman of the National People's Congress. But it is headed by the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, currently Xi Jinping. As I mentioned, the party is able to maintain its control over the government apparatus by ensuring that it gets its person into positions of leadership at every single administrative level and every single functional bureaucracy within the government. Not only does the person have to be a party member, but the person is chosen by the party. And so basically what this means is, and this is something that's akin to other one-party systems, whether they're communist or not. This is very much the case in Iraq as well, under the Ba'ath Party, where if you were somebody who was very good at your job and you kept on going kind of up the career ladder, at some point you would have to join the party in order to move to the next level. Because the only person who could occupy that position would be somebody who would be a party member. And so what you do is you have a lot of people who essentially join the party for professional development reasons, as opposed to ideological reasons. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. People have to be recommended to join the party. They can't just show up and volunteer. and they go through a rigorous background check, not just themselves but their families. They're asked all sorts of questions. What did your family do during the Cultural Revolution? What did you do during the turmoil of 1989? These are all standard background questions. And even after somebody's accepted provisionally into the party, even after they spend a year or whatever the term is at any given time as a probationary member, they are continually evaluated even once they become full-fledged party members, and this is something that really becomes kind of a big part of their life from there on in. One of the ways in which becoming a party member complicates people's lives in China is not this idea that all of a sudden they become these ideological automatons, but rather they are usually people who have a tremendous amount of responsibilities within their own government portfolios. Now all of a sudden they also have to contend with all sorts of demands and incentives and constraints as a result of them being being members of the Chinese Communist Party. And these types of constraints and incentives tend to work across purposes. And so one of the things that's really interesting, if you watch somebody who's gone from being a non-party member to becoming a party member over time, is the degree to which they essentially lose any semblance of free time. And their lives really become kind of taken over with the various types of demands of kind of their joint government and party responsibilities. Now, in addition to ensuring that the ranking person in any government institution is a party member, this is referred to as nomenclatura, you also have this idea of interlocking directorates. So the party apparatus essentially shadows the government apparatus throughout the Chinese state. And so for every provincial governor, you've got a provincial party secretary. For every minister in Beijing, you've got a party secretary of the ministry party committee. These two people, the party member and their government counterpart, are both party members, and ostensibly they have the same administrative rank, but the party member always has a higher rank within the party apparatus, which is another way in which the party ensures that it has leverage and power over the government. In addition to that, you've got what is very often a somewhat arbitrary allocation of party members within any particular unit, whether it's a workshop on a factory floor, whether it's a wing of a hospital, whether it's a school, whether it's a ministry. And these party members get together and meet usually once a week, oftentimes for some reason on a Wednesday, to discuss various types of party-related issues that particular unit is facing, and this is something that happens largely undetected to people who are not part of this, but it's a key part of what these party members who are chosen to be part of these what are referred to as party core groups as kind of part of their key party responsibilities. So as a result, what you have is you've got the party superimposed onto government institutions throughout the Chinese body politic. And the degree to which the party micromanages or not its government counterpart is something that I think speaks to what a particular dynamic of at any given time in China might look like. Which brings me to China today. And this is something that it's very much one of the worst things anybody can do with regards to China is try to predict the future. It's almost as difficult as, well, it's slightly more difficult, I think, than trying to explain the present. But essentially what we find ourselves in today in China is a very, very interesting set of new developments, particularly if you've been following what I've been talking about so far. Because the new administration under Xi Jinping has really taken as one of his key strategies for kind of recasting the Chinese state as kind of working, reestablishing, and remolding various types of institutional relations. So the conventional wisdom is that Xi Jinping is centralizing his power as no other leader has since Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. And this also has been reinforced by any number of different ideological debates, suggesting a leftward shift in terms of understanding kind of party history as a justification for the way in which the party behaves today. This is also evidenced kind of on the street level, quite literally, by Xi's tough anti-corruption campaign and has been seen or reflected in China's kind of more aggressive posturing in the Asia-Pacific theater outside of China's actual landmass. But what I want to focus on really is just very briefly some of the institutional developments that have taken place since the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. Third plena of central committees, particularly central committees where a new leadership comes to the fore, are really, really important because usually for the first or second plenum, they're still jockeying for power. They're still trying to consolidate their authority relations. They're still trying to work through kind of what the substance of their policy prescriptions will be. But the November 2013 third plenum of the 18th Central Committee came out with a 60-point Central Committee decision, which, according to many observers, is easily the most comprehensive policy document passed at a Central Committee plenum since the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in December of 1978, which signaled the movement away from Maoism towards the reform era that China is still on today. There are many elements to this 60-point decision, but it signals two contradictory developments. On the one hand, China maintains its commitment to increasingly liberalize the economy. But, and this is where it gets contradictory, it's doing so in a way in which the Chinese Communist Party is now reasserting its control to an unprecedented degree for the express purpose of, among many other things, liberalizing the economy. So towards this end, what you have is this idea, and this comes from recent work by Barry Naughton, that the decision argues that the market is not co-equal with the macro control over the government, that in fact the market is more important than the macro control provided by the government. And one of the things that the current administration is trying to do is to shrink the influence of certain gargantuan bureaucracies which have led to the ossification of economic decision-making and which have led to the slight cooling of the economy in recent years. One of the ways in which Xi is doing this is through the creation of a central leading group for the comprehensive deepening of reform. This is a leadership small group which is not a government body, but a party organ. It consists of 43 members, 20 of them who have national leadership rank, but what's really, really interesting is none of them have an economic policy portfolio. In addition, there are some 6 subordinate leadership small groups. But the key thing here is that this deepening of reform leadership small group has been replicated at local levels, at the province, and it has complicated traditional promotion and performance indicators of local cadres. So in the past, these have focused on these performance indicators, which really are the main ways in which cadres are evaluated for promotion, is fostering GDP growth, raising local revenues, developing urban areas, maintaining social stability, as well as implementing the one-child policy. The new indicators, as suggested by this deepening reform leadership small group, focus more on kind of more nebulous ideas like reform, balance, environmental improvement, and clean and honest living. Not only are these far more vague and ambiguous, but these are not nearly as easily quantifiable as these other traditional performance indicators, which lead me to believe that this is going to be something that's going to be a hot point of contestation between the national level authorities and local cadres in the months and possibly years to come. So to conclude this last part of the module, Xi Jinping is essentially using the model to subdue the government and open up the economy, making it more dynamic in the process. At least that is the goal. What this indicates is a bold recasting of the political arena for economic and other policy decisions. But as with everything else, and if people can take away anything from this module, it's this idea that implementation is a very, very rough and tumble area of Chinese politics, where a policy might be proposed, it might be adopted, but the devil is always in the details of implementation. And we'll just have to be patient and see what unfolds.